Okay, now that we're done with the DK collection, it's time to move on to the Taschen collection. Now, I'll actually explain what Taschen is, because I think fewer people know about it. Taschen is a UK, apparently based company that publishes a lot of books that are either quite lively visually or informatively. I'm really only familiar with their film enthusiasts book, but they do have an art section on their website, and I think there's a travel section, and then there's a couple of odd books, such as like the Bigger Book of Butts. That's literally the title of it. Yeah, that's kind of odd, isn't it? And another thing that's odd about them is that you have to pay attention to what version of a book that you're getting, because broadly speaking, a book can have anywhere to four sizes, or at least when it comes to like the film enthusiast books or that kind of a thing. And you have a limited edition, which is a really, really big book that is super high in price and is only like 5,000 copies, that kind of a thing. Then you have the XXL edition, which is the quote unquote normal edition of the books. It's basically a book that it truly is a coffee table book, probably weighs close to like 15 pounds, that kind of a thing. Then you have the trade edition of the books, which is a slightly smaller version of the XXL ones in terms of size, but in terms of weight, it's almost half the weight. So imagine trying to read, an 8.5 pound book versus a 14.5 pound book. You almost always would want to go for the 8.5, I would think. And then there's also a 40th edition, which is a slimmed down version of the XXL or trade edition, where they remove a lot of photographs from the books and some of the text in order to make the book a normal size, but because it's such a normal size, it's easy to print over and over, so the cost of that is pretty cheap, whereas the trade editions typically go for like $80 retail, and then the XXL 150 to 200 retail, and then depending on what website you use, that amount will easily fluctuate between pounds and dollars. So pay attention. It's possible for all books to have the first free, but they don't necessarily do. 40th edition is entirely the author's discretion. So this first one is the trade edition of the James Bond archives. And for those of you who know about this book, you can tell based on the cover of it, this is the edition that goes up to No Time to Die, because they previously had an edition of this book for Skyfall, and then what was the one that came after it? Spectre. There we go. But it seems like they only add a few additional pages to this book, even though you're supposed to read it like this. And it truly is a stunning book. Rest in peace, Mr. Bond. But yeah, you've got information about Ian Fleming, so it briefly touches upon the books, and then you get information on every work of film for Bond that has ever been produced, except for the black and white Casino Royale, because yes, they even have a section for Never Say Never Again, and the stupid Casino Royale spoof that they made in '67. Oh my god. Duh. Even though I am hypocritical about that, because I do own it, begrudgingly, but I do. Those DVDs have different extras. But you really want to pay attention to that Paul Duncan author, because he's written tons of books for Taschen over the years, like he's written that James Bond archives, and then he's done archives for a bunch of other products, such as a couple of foreign filmmakers whose names I'm not even going to try to pronounce. He also made like a Godfather photo album, which is like pictures from all of the Godfather movies that sort of tell the story. And I truly mean sort of, because it skips over a lot and it's pictures rather than text. Alfred Hitchcock, the complete films, even though when you break it down, you realize that each film only has like 5 or so pages, and all of those have like an intro segment. But then there's a couple of other big archive things that he did, one of which being... Come on. The Charlie Chaplin archives, which is something that tells the entire history of Charlie Chaplin. This is actually one of his earlier works. If you want to know a little bit more about Paul, he's actually got a YouTube channel, which I'll link in the description, but he's also done interviews for a couple of other channels about various books that he's done. He flips through the book, this particular book, on a video that he did, so I'm not going to do it. Now, those 2 books, they're the trade editions of them. There is a $200 edition, but there's no 40th edition for those books. Paul's made it very clear that he's not going to make a 40th edition for the Bond book unless it's just a photo-only one. Charlie Chaplin, it's completely up to the publishing company on that, but given how long it's been, I somehow doubt that he's going to do it. But Paul is probably most well known for creating the Star Wars archives. This book being for the original trilogy, this book being for the prequel trilogy. Paul's made it very clear that there are no plans to make anything for the sequel trilogy until maybe 15 years down the line for audiences to rest, and even then, when he was setting out to make these, the idea was to talk about George Lucas's Star Wars saga, which is what this is. He also makes addendums in the bigger versions of these books for other products that were created by Lucas, though unfortunately he didn't do anything for Star Wars The Clone Wars and the micro series that they made in 2003, because he chose to replace that section with information about the special edition versions of the original trilogy, despite the fact that he included that section in the bigger version of this book rather than the bigger version of this book. Oh, and FYI, these 2 are actually the same amount of pages, give or take a couple. It's just that I think the paper's thinner, that kind of a thing. Now, I'm sure that you're probably thinking, well, being a Star Wars enthusiast, wouldn't you want the bigger editions of the book? Well, I do, but here's the problem. There aren't any trade editions of the book out there, so I'm holding out hope that they eventually release the trade editions like they did for James Bond and Charlie Chaplin, because when I was thinking about getting Bond, they announced the trade edition literally a couple of days after I learned of its existence, so I just decided to wait 5 or so months and then get the trade edition. Because the total amount that I paid for the Charlie Chaplin and Bond archives there is less than what I would end up paying for either one of the bigger versions of these. Heck, you could add in what I paid for these 2, and then the price of just one of the big books at this point would still be pretty darn close, if not more, than all that stuff. So I'm just hoping that they come out with a trade edition, especially since it seems like the 2 books are pretty much out of print on Amazon, and it seems a better way to, and other like third-party websites, so maybe it'll happen, maybe it won't. But I really don't want that 15-pound book, even though it'll mean that the images look a little bigger, because someplace in here, it has like that famous picture of the Falcon getting away from the Falcon getting away from the Star Destroyer. So imagine how that would look even bigger, you know? And then as to what is included in the big book but isn't in the smaller one, I've pretty much told you all of it. There's also some bits about George Lucas's early history that isn't in the small version of the original trilogy book. Then this next one, we're done with everything written by Paul here. These are all other people from Taschen now. I also picked up the book, The NASA Archives. I only have the 40th edition because it doesn't seem like there's going to be an $80 edition of this book, especially since the retail price for the bigger version seemed to be like $150 naturally, and the dimensions of it kind of indicated that that is the trade edition. But also, if you go online and compare the table of contents that's in this book to the table of contents that is on most pictures of the big one, I really couldn't find any difference. So that tells me that the main difference is just how big the pictures are. I'd wager that practically every bit of text is still in here. So since I wasn't terribly interested in this, I just got this because it was the last book that from the company that I felt like getting. I grabbed it. So there you go. Now these next ones, these are books that I have both the trade edition and the 40th edition of. First, we've got the Stanley Kubrick archives. But what's interesting is that if you look at the copyright things for these two books, this 40th edition was actually published before this trade edition. And what's also weird is that all other 40 editions that I got from the company, they have a straight spine, whereas this has, you know, like the curved spine that you see in more hardcover books these days. And I swear that I actually saw this in a store someplace years ago. Wow, I swear that I did. And also, this trade edition here, it won't show well on camera, but it's actually shorter than the other trade editions that I got. I find that kind of odd. So what's the difference between these two? As far as I can tell, there's actually no difference in text. It just has to do with how much photographs are in here, because that black section there, what that is that it's like photographic retellings of a lot of Kubrick's films, and it's actually rather nice, these pictures, but the problem is some of them aren't structured that well, because you know how when I showed you that Millennium Falcon picture, it took up every bit of both sides of the page? Well, look at this. You notice how Kirk Douglas is noticeably dissected there? Now, technically, I think every bit of the picture is there, but it's not really formatted that well. Now, sometimes it's not so bad. Like this one, it's not nearly as bad, but I feel like they could have done a little better with this. But it's still a nice wealth of information, and I do like having the ability to do both versions of a book if I can. Then next, we've got the Walt Disney Animated Archives from 1921 to 1968, which is right after Disney passed away. So you've got the Jungle Book in there and maybe one other movie, and It's a nice book that details some of the early works of Disney and various things that they used to pitch and stuff like that. And they cut it off at a nice point, but I truly stress animated because I seem to recall that they made like a Davy Crockett movie during this time. There's no mention of it in these books. And somehow I have a tough time believing that when they come out with the next volume, because why else would you put the year there if you're not going to make more? Somehow I don't get the feeling that they're going to start incorporating like Pixar or the other animated stuff within there, because up until recently, a lot of those other animated studios that they owned, they had like their own track records. So, yeah. Again, though, I have both because there's some text missing in this version from the small one, because they have to cut out a lot of photographs, but they do a better job of formatting things here. But the main bit of text that they don't have in here is at the end of like most movies, they have like a short, I guess, producers section, for lack of a better term. I really can't describe it more than that. So that's what it is in terms of text. But in terms of images that they cut out, it's quite a lot, because I'm on Fantasia here. I gotta be almost there. Okay, I don't remember it being this long. Maybe it was. And I'm just clueless. Okay, well, apparently that many pages right here is just images without text. That's crazy, isn't it? So yeah, it really merits having both of these. However, I've got one tiny bit of contention with that book. Hey, Mickey. Well, if you look in the book, you'll go, well, where the heck is Mickey? He's on the cover, but he's not there. Well, that's because he's got his own book. Yeah. So I have absolutely no clue what the difference is between text that's included in here, but there definitely are some differences. But it's a nice book. It does a decent job of apparently detailing Mickey's history here, because, yeah, Mouse is born, Mickey comes to the comics, the movies, Mickey on the air, password Mickey Mouse, modernizing Mickey, 21st century Mouse. You just get a lot of cool stuff, yeah. I think that the bigger edition of this is going to be a little less worth it than some of the other bigger ones, but it's still a nice thing to have, even though I do have to keep it like this on the shelf, because one, the shelf that it's on is too short to have it up the other way, and also it would throw off the look of all the others more if I kept it that way. So yeah. So that takes care of my Taschen collection. I really don't think I'm going to get that much more from them, because after I get the bigger versions of the Star Wars books, I can't really think of that much else that I do, because, as I said, I've looked into that bigger NASA book. I really don't see too much merit there. And there was like a Stan Lee book that they only made in like a limited edition. I'm not going to pay X amount, like a couple thousand to get the book. Same thing with the Rocky thing, even though I think that's more of an art book. Sorry, Paul. And, Yeah, I said that summarizes up the Taschen bit. Alright, just one more book update to go. See you then.